Bonjour et bienvenue à la petite église française du Saint-Esprit for our latest video in the series about Elie Neau that we've been recording about the icon and about the history of Elie Neau as well. Today we're very lucky because we have with us a guest today to talk a little bit about Elie Neau. And Richter is the rector of St. Ambrose Church in Boulder, Colorado, and she's recently written an STM thesis on Elie Neau. So we're going to be talking about that. But you were ordained after a career as a French teacher, so that's something that's very close to our heart here at Saint-Esprit with our free French lessons. She's also very familiar with living abroad. 11 years?
11 years, yes.
Both in France and in
France
Germany.
and Germany. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
So you can give us a little international perspective on Elie Neau as well, which would be very, very much appreciated. She was a member of the Bishop's Advisory Committee on Liturgy and Music in the Diocese of Kentucky before moving out to Colorado. And as I just mentioned, the STM thesis on Elie Neau.
Yes.
So, Anne, how did you come across Elie Neau? How did he move into your orbit?
Well, he found me, actually. I've always been interested in Huguenots, and I have Huguenot ancestry. So when I was at Virginia Seminary doing my Anglican dip, I was doing a history paper on Mannequin Town, the Huguenot settlement in Virginia. And I was in the archives in the microfiche, and I was looking through, and I saw a letter in French. And since I love French, I said, oh, a letter in French, an old letter in French. And so I started reading it, and I was fascinated. I didn't know who Elie Neau was at the time, but it was a letter about the terrible conditions of the enslaved people in New York, and I thought, this is really interesting. So I got a copy of it and took it home. And I said, someday I'm going to learn more about this. And it took me about 10 years. But when I was at Sewanee doing my work, I was going to get a DMin, Doctor of Ministry. And then I just kept not wanting to do any of the practical projects that I would have to do to get a DMin. And I kept thinking about Elie Neau. I thought this would be my one chance to find out more about Elie Neau. And so that's what I did. I switched programs and started researching Neau.
Wonderful. And what? How long ago was that?
When I found the letter was in 2007.
Oh, right.
So it was a very long time ago.
Yes.
Yeah. So I kept it for a long time, thinking, someday I'll have time to look into this and see who this is.
Ready for each other.
Yes.
It's rather a nice thing.
Yes.
And so once you discovered the existence of this person and started to explore a little bit about him, what was how did you go about? Did you have initial questions, or did the questions come about once you read the letter and started to discover?
Yes.
What was your approach?
It was. I found out early on that he had written cantiques, that he had written these hymns to the psalm tunes. And I like mystical poetry. And I read, I don't remember if it was Leonard, the historian, who was talking about the mystic of the galleys. And I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. So I wanted to read those to see what he really believed, what his theology really was through those cantiques. So that started out to be my interest, but then it was really hard to stick to one interest, because when I started reading his letters that he wrote to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG, from New York, I thought, oh, this school for the enslaved people is really interesting. So I had to do a lot of background reading is really how I went about it, because I wasn't a specialist of the time period. I had to learn a lot about European pietism to understand kind of the forces that molded him in the Atlantic world. And then once I'd done background on that, I had to do background on the islands, on Saint-Domingue, where he had been, and on Boston, where he spent time, and on Huguenot France. I knew a little more about that, but I had to learn more about that, and the whole role of psalm singing in Protestantism. And then I had to learn about New York. So lots of background reading. Then I got into the letters that he wrote as a catechist to the SPG in London. And then I found there's the published Cantique, but then there are the ones that are not published. And those are in a box C in the archives. So I got hold of those through British online archives. Because otherwise, to really see the documents, you have to go to England.
Right.
And but I was happy to see that they have been photographed, and you can get them online. So
You mentioned that you were interested in mystical poetry and that side of him. What do you think that his circumstances led to that mystical approach, or do you think he was sort of born that way?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, he started writing them in prison in France. So I imagine he was formed by Huguenot psalm singing. So he knew the psalms backwards and forwards. And then he probably, he's not the only one who was writing. It was kind of a common thing to write original lyrics to a psalm tune. That has happened since the 16th century. Protestants have been doing that in France, and the Pietists were doing that in in Holland and different places. And so that was a common expression. So I think, but his mysticism had a tinge of the heart religion that was circulating at the time. But he probably had a mystical bent, in his soul, and to be in prison in the conditions that he was in, he would he would understand the suffering of Christ. And I think he took comfort in the fact that Jesus could relate to his suffering. I think that's where that whole union with God and through suffering.
Yes. There's something very, very embodied about his hymns, isn't there, which I find very moving.
Yes.
I know that in the archives of Saint-Esprit, we have a letter that was addressed to Elie Neau by the consistory at the time. And in this letter, they said, "We long to hold the hands that the chains have made holy."
Oh, yes.
So there seems to be a sort of... he inspired that in others as well to see that.
And it was in the other galley slaves, the other Huguenot prisoners would write similar kinds of things. They Elie Neau is the only one who wrote and who survived to write more later, but they would write similarly mystical kinds of and that whole embodied suffering was a big theme for them as well.
Do you think that informed his catechetical method with the slaves?
Yes.
Also, would that be something that he was able to access in a teaching environment?
Yes, because he wrote in one of his letters to London that he sent them his songs, a big packet that he wanted the SPG to publish. But the SPG never published it, which is sad. But he sent it, and with the letter with that packet that he sent, he said, I have written some of these in prison, and some of these songs I've written now in New York, and they are the essence of and the content of what I teach to my pupils. So he really... I think he may have used some of the later ones, because the later songs that he wrote are written, they're not as mystical, and they have nice proper doxologies at the end from Anglican liturgy, and they are numbered, and it says pause in between where people are supposed to pause, and they are more, like he wrote a psalm sung version of the Nicene Creed and different, so things that he would have wanted his students to memorize and sing. So I think, don't know, but I think he probably had them, besides just singing the Psalms, which he did, might have had them singing his own work.
People often wonder about Elie Neau when they encounter him. What moved him to? He didn't exactly turn his back on the French Protestant Church.
No, he didn't.
But did you get an impression through your studies and your method of why he decided to switch boats and become
it's controversial among historians, but because he does write that he tells the SPG what they would want to hear, which is that he loves the Book of Common Prayer, and he used it in prison for his own devotions. He had a copy, and he loves the liturgy. So he may have. He was very reluctant to leave the French Church. He was best friends with Reverend Perret, and he said he couldn't leave as long as Perret was alive. And he dawdled and dawdled. And Reverend Vesey from Trinity said that he could not be a catechist unless he left the French Church. And he was very upset about that. He wrote complaining to the Bishop of London why he would have to leave a church that is in friendly cooperation with the Anglican Church, why he would have to make that choice. But if he was going to be a catechist, he finally had to.
Yeah.
And that's why he did it, I think.
I think all of us who've encountered his astonishing story have been moved in all sorts of different ways by it, both here in America and over back in Europe. Is there something that you wanted to share with us about how his story has impacted you or your outlook on your ministry or the way you preach or the way you see the liturgy?
Right. Yes. I think that I really appreciate his perseverance and his stubbornness to do what he felt he was called to do. He felt a call to teach the enslaved Africans and indigenous people here in New York City. And they tried to get him to go teach the indigenous people in the state of New York. And he said, I don't want to go running around after people up there. I want to teach the ones here. They're right here living with us, and they're the ones. And he fought the authorities sometimes, and he stood up for what he believed was right. And so that, to me, is an encouragement to follow your call and to do what you feel like you're called to do. So personally, and the other thing is he was a lay person. He was not ordained. He had not gone to school past age 12. He had self-taught man. And so he did all that as a lay person. So it just kind of shows what a determined layperson can do. And, he didn't always follow all the church rules, and he was doing what he felt like he was called to do. So I think that's good for people today, the laity as well as clergy. So,
do you think he has a slightly different thing to teach Americans than he does, say, in Europe, where the story perhaps may be slightly different
story
about slavery, but it seems like his mysticism may make his poetry and what have you. Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah, with this universal. I think, he is part of our story, of the ambiguity of our story here in this country with slavery, because he was a slave owner. He didn't condemn the institution of slavery. He was a man of his time. He figured there is a hierarchy, and in this life, we follow that hierarchy, and if we're at the bottom, we're at the bottom. And so he wanted to save the souls of the enslaved. But it's because he really believed that was the most important thing. He believed it for himself. He believed it for other white slave owners. He believed it for everybody, that this world is not what matters. It's the next world that matters and is eternal. So if that's what his drive was. And for us today, we say, oh, that's not, we condemn that. But for him, that was what he believed. So, and he fought, again, at the same time, while he was committed to the system, he did teach enslaved people to read. He went and visited them in their homes when they were sick, which the other catechists didn't do. He would crawl into where they were living in their attics and sit with them. And he cared about them. He even wrote in his letters that that Black people were not inferior to white people, that we were all beloved by God and all the same. So they weren't all saying that, the catechists and the theologians of the time. So it's an ambiguous, he's a man of his time, and he's still trying to, within that framework, do what is right and be compassionate. And he was horrified at the conditions of the enslaved.
It's fascinating when you look from our perspective here in the 21st century and the recent discussions about the atrocity of the slave trade and of enslaved persons, and how we can't use our current categories to impose something.
Right.
On the
right.
past.
We can't impose our understanding. And it's also, if when people 200 years from now are looking back on us with the environmental crisis, for example, and what are we doing about it? So it's kind of a similar thing. We don't know how we'll be judged for a number of things in the future.
But it must have been fascinating to be able to discover a little bit more about what life was like in the early 1700s in New York City.
Yes, it was. It was a melting pot even then of people from all over the world and all different kinds of religions they had your Lutherans and your Dutch Reformed and your Huguenots and your Anglicans, and then they had the Labadists and the Quakers, and there were just all kinds of Jews. There were all kinds of peoples together. And I think about in around 1700, about 41% of people owned enslaved, either Africans or indigenous people. So everybody had at least one enslaved person. And they lived with the family kind of they weren't segregated away somewhere. They were sleeping in the kitchen or in a basement or in an attic, but in the same neighborhood, often working along with the master and mistress. The women were having to work in the kitchens, do domestic work. They were sometimes sent to market to sell things in the market. Enslaved men lots of them worked at the docks, hoisting all the heavy cargo. And they also were taught trades, so they would work alongside their art. If their master was an artisan of some kind, they would work in the blacksmith shop or whatever along with him. So, there were some free Black people in those days. They had to kind of live out, unfortunately. And let's see what else. The Huguenots owned a number. The Huguenots were major slave owners because they were merchants. So the merchants made the money, and so they had wealthy people owned enslaved Africans.
Yeah, I remember when I first came and went up to Huguenot Street up in Newport, and they were saying, well, of course, the Huguenots that had suffered so much that they wouldn't have owned slaves and put them through a similar suffering.
Yeah, they did.
It's amazing how far the things have come in just the space of 30 years, thanks to research like yours and bringing these stories forward in a way that we can tell them with some sort of integrity and self-examination as well. What do you think that Elie Neau would think of what we're doing now? I know that's a big question.
In the church, you mean?
In the church.
Or...
what would his sermon sound like?
Well, no, he was very... he was interested in upright morals, and he was very devout. He had his own little altar and chapel in his home where they say he prayed 3 times a day with his family. So he would approve probably of we're still doing the daily office. But he was critical of his time for the number of people who did not attend church, who were not interested in either a ethical, moral life or in piety. And so he had not good things to say about them. So he would probably have not good things to say about us that there are so few people who attend church and who are interested in bettering society. He would like the betterment of society. I think he would like what the Episcopal Church is doing now by trying to be involved in our communities and in the world. He would be all about that. And he would be in favor of ecumenical dialogue and ecumenical action because he didn't care what denomination you were. You had to be a proper Trinitarian. He didn't want any of these deists or any of these. But if you were a proper Trinitarian, then, if you were working with Reformed and Anglican and Lutheran, in his will, he left money to the Lutheran pastor, to Trinity Church for their school, to the French Church for aid for Huguenot refugees, but the Lutheran. So he left money to he knew the pastors from the different traditions.
Is it true that he started a sort of study or prayer group, the first ecumenical prayer group in the city?
He was not happy that the others didn't really want to come. Reverend Vesey would not come because it was not approved by the bishop. And the Lutheran, I don't think, always came, but he and Pastor Perret always met, and he wanted everybody to be there. Yeah, they had a prayer group that met and followed a certain pattern. They said the devotions together, and they read a passage of scripture and discussed it. And then I think Reverend Perret gave a little sermon, and then they had prayers at the end. So,
it's rather wonderful to imagine it. It happening. I wish more of it happened now.
I know, that kind of thing. He loved the goals of the SPCK, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, and they believed in founding libraries and having devotional meetings and things like that. So he was a member of the SPCK. And he really liked that whole idea of these societies that could get together.
One of the most shocking things I discovered when I was looking into it a few years ago in England, they had a series of programs to commemorate the abolition of the slave trade.
Yeah.
And they were speaking to some representatives from SPCK, and the researcher who was posing the questions said, did you realize that actually at the Codrington plantation in Barbados, the enslaved workers had SPCK branded onto their bodies with a hot iron. And it seems like some of these institutions are now getting to the point where they can begin to tell that story and apologize for what's happened in the past. Do you think that Elie Neau and his story is a way into that discussion in some way?
That's possible because he's kind of a in-between person between the horrors and the good, and I think it could be helpful. And he wrote so much. We know what he thought. That's
well, Anne, it's been so wonderful talking to you about Elie Neau, and lovely to explore his life in a little bit more detail together. Is there anything that you think we've missed that you'd like to add?
Well, I think the one thing something like this is you have to say is that the record, the knowledge that we have of Neau and his work is all through the eyes and pens of white people. We don't have what his pupils thought. And unfortunately, it would be wonderful if we did. We do know that in the slave rebellion, as they call it, of 1712 in New York, Neau was accused of inciting the rebellion because several of his pupils were the leaders of the rebellion. But Neau, of course, wrote that he thought it was horrible. He didn't consciously foment it. But I think it's possible that just by bringing together those who were enslaved, giving them a chance to talk to each other on the way to their classes, by teaching them to read and gain knowledge, and by teaching them the Bible and the Psalms, and giving them the power of psalm singing together, and could give them the confidence and the understanding of freedom that comes through Christianity, that could have empowered them to say, we don't want to be enslaved anymore. We also know that the two of the leaders of the rebellion, Juan and Jose, were from Saint-Domingue, where Elie Neau had lived. They spoke Spanish. They had been baptized in the islands by Catholic missionaries, so they were Roman Catholic. Then they were on a ship, and a pirate caught them off of a ship. I think they were sailors, and the pirate imprisoned them and brought them to this country. So their story parallels Neau's story, and that cannot have missed. You must see it. They appealed to the authorities in New York for freedom, and they were refused, and they were kept enslaved. So they were leaders in the rebellion. They weren't killed. They were pardoned by Governor Hunter, and. I don't know, but I can't help wonder if Neau didn't know that he must have known their story. They must have known his. They were in his school, and Neau was friends with Governor Hunter, so he might have played a role in getting them. In getting them pardoned. So anyway, we don't know what his pupils thought. But I think they gained some idea and some strength of freedom from what he, not on purpose, taught them.
Right.
Yeah.
And he sort of continues to teach us today, in no small measure, thanks to your research and being with us today. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to chat to you and to deepen our knowledge of an extraordinary man.
Yes, thank indeed. You. Thank you so much. Yes.
And do join us. Neau's anniversary is coming up on the 7th of September. I think we're planning at Saint-Esprit to go down and pay respects at his grave in Trinity Graveyard downtown, as we did last year for the 300th anniversary of his
Yes.
of his death. So you can expect another video around that particular time. And in the meantime, thank you again.
Yes.
And it's been lovely having you and
Thank
chatting.
you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.